I kept finding in the book, as I did research, were people's names. Whenever you see, I'm not counting George W. Bush, but if somebody's born in the 1800s and they are George W. something, it is almost always George Washington. And so that caused me to write a little item here, kind of collecting what I found. Long after the American Revolution, Americans were naming their sons after our first president. George W. Hummer and his namesake grandson are not the only George Washingtons in this book. The others are Hart Pence, our first trash collector, Freeland, a Milford photographer, Wismer, killer of Clarence Doane, he was a constable, and the two Eddies, George W. Eddies. Giving babies famous names was fashionable in the 19th century. This book also mentions 2 Benjamin Franklin Fackenthals, 2 Andrew Jacksons, McCrae and Champenour, 2 Chester Arthurs, Fargo and Nice, a Horace Greeley Jacobs, 2 Winfield Scotts, Case and Miller, Wade Hampton Davidson, 2 DeWitt Clintons, Hugh Ho and Dalrymple, and my personal favorite, Marquis de Lafayette Schroep. It took me a while. I kept reading things and references to Schroep, but he went by the name of Mart, M-A-R-T, Schroep. And then finally, when he died, his obituary was in the paper, and I learned that the reason he was called Mart, that was his full name. Railroad station agent Byron Hoe named his son Ulysses S. Grant Hoe in 1864, but that was not based on admiration alone. The baby's great-grandmother was the general's aunt. So, there you go. Now, another thing I discovered while working on this that maybe other people already know about was the big spectator sport before baseball caught on in the late 1800s was called pedestrianism, also known as heel and toe walking. And it was just speed walking. I guess you break into a run, it's disqualified. And I guess experts could tell whether you're doing it right. And that was the big thing. Madison Square Garden, people would buy tickets and go and see heel and toe walkers. And a couple of the greats of the sport would come out into places like Frenchtown and race the local talent and put on exhibitions of really fast walking, which again and again, I found out over and over how starved people were for entertainment. This is really an example of
the days before Netflix.
Yeah, or before.
It's still an Olympic sport.
Is it?
Walking, yeah. I mean, it wasn't called pedestrianism, but it certainly was when I used to watch it.
There's a guy who came to Frenchtown for a demonstration who was known as, I believe, Dan O'Leary, the plucky pedestrian. So, anyway, pedestrianism. Now, there's this guy who was really interesting. His name was Dr. William Rice, and he came to Frenchtown in 1858 and started practicing medicine. And he became mayor of Frenchtown. And later, he moved to Trenton and became mayor of Trenton. So, rummaging around on the internet, I wanted to verify this see if there's a website that lists the mayors of Trenton. And not only was there a website, there was a photograph showing all the mayors of Frenchtown. And it'd be nice to have a picture of the second mayor of Frenchtown. I'd rather have one of the first mayor of Frenchtown, but I failed. I haven't got that. However, so what was on the website was this picture. Okay, and as you can imagine, the pictures there are not very clear once you blow them up. You carve out the one you want and blow it up. And in the write-up, it said that this bank of pictures is in the lobby of the of City Hall in Trenton. So I went to City Hall in Trenton, and there it was, but it was kind of up on the wall, and so there was no attendant in the lobby, but there was a chair. So I got the chair and moved it over to that bank of photographs and got my phone and took a picture so we could get a look at Dr. Rice. Not a good picture. Luckily it's small in the book, it doesn't look that bad. But people are very forgiving if they get the feeling that's the best you could do. Okay? So that's Dr. William Rice. But Dr. Rice, he had an interesting incident happen to him when he was in Trenton. Let's see, I'll read you about it. On Saturday, June 12th, 1875, at 3 a.m., Boilermaker Sylvester O'Toole, age about 40, rang Rice's doorbell. Okay, this is middle of the night. He said his wife urgently needed medical attention, and the doctor opened the door. O'Toole walked right in, and Rice recognized him as a former patient. Rice told authorities, quote, "He looked me in the eye, came right up to me and said, 'You are responsible for my sickness.' Then he pulled out a pistol, put it right to my breast. I said to him, 'Don't shoot.' O'Toole repeated the accusation and fired. I took hold of him and tried to push him off and get him down. It was then, I think, he shot me in the shoulder. The first shot hit me in the breast. I believe I am about to die." O'Toole ran off. Now this is me writing from news clippings. O'Toole ran off into the night, but was captured within an hour. At his arraignment, O'Toole said he had not been trying to kill the doctor. If that had been his plan, he could have done it easily. Despite his good intentions, he was sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The doctor recovered and became mayor of Trenton, holding office in 1879 to 80. The bullets remained in his body and did not trouble him. But what did trouble him was his wife, Lydia. In 1889, he sued her for divorce, alleging infidelity. Testimony in court, this is the sexy part of my book. The testimony in court led to the headline in the Jersey City News, "Mrs. Rice and Mr. Knapp, a Trenton wife has lots of fun with a hotel clerk." Her affair lasted for years, during which time she rented a secret post office box under the name Mrs. Leslie for their correspondence. Friends testified that in 1884, she referred to her husband as "that old hog." And in 1885, at Rice's brother's burial, she allegedly said of her husband, "I hate him. They buried the wrong man today. I will leave him yet." After the divorce, Lydia returned to Frenchtown and resided at the National Hotel, later relocating to the Frenchtown Cemetery. Her grave will probably be on my tour in the spring. The doctor remained in Trenton with 3 live-in servants to care for him. One evening in 1901, Dr. Rice lay down on a couch after a hearty supper and died almost immediately. One wonders about Rice's medical acumen. It seems he made a bad guess about whatever was ailing O'Toole, who filed his malpractice suit with a revolver. Then, when shot, Rice gave himself a prognosis of death. He was off by 26 years. As for his final hours, if he had been expecting a short nap when he lay down on the couch, he was wrong again. So, there you go. A little fun with ancient tragedies. So,
This is right, Mr. Wrong.
Now, there was another phenomenon that I learned of that was a big thing in Frenchtown and Hunterdon generally, maybe all over, I don't know. And that is moving day. On April 1st, that's when people moved from one house to another. And it was a really smart thing to have it coordinated. Some of the moves weren't so smart. I got the impression from what I read that some editors thought people would just move for the sake of moving and without good practical purpose went to a lot of trouble. But you know, your lease ends, you're moving out April 1, you So there's all these write-ups. It was news, and it would say, let's see, they would call it. There would be headlines like. Some spring changes or moving around in town, that kind of thing. And you would see, for example, in 1904, M.F. Bellis moved from 4th Street to Bridge Street. C.A. Manners from 2nd Street moved to the house vacated by Bellis. G.L. Smith from Harrison to the house vacated by Manners. Mrs. Anna Hoff from 2nd Street to house vacated by Smith. So there would be like a chain of things. And there was, wagons in the street piled high with furniture, people going from one place to another. And if you're in the country, farmers likewise were relocating at that time. If you were a tenant farmer, and they would bring their livestock, and they'd be driving a herd of cattle on some back road, and then another guy with another herd of cattle was coming this way, which made for some excitement and confusion. Again, some entertainment for the folks, and also everybody who helped people move, it was a tradition to have a great big dinner. So that was an enjoyable part of it. But that died out by the 1920s. And let's see, I have a note here. Moving day had an unintended consequence on April 1st, 1876. The upheaval of moving caused Frenchtown's William Cook, age 13, to find some gunpowder and conduct an experiment. It was a success, burning him about the face and head. But he was out and about within a week. This was the same resilient boy who had been run over by a wagon a couple of weeks earlier. 4 years later, he would be working among dangerous machinery of a Lambertville spoke mill, hopefully made more cautious by his Frenchtown misadventures. So, that's moving day. Now, I mentioned runaway horses. I have a whole section about that. Starts out, imagine that your car is a prey animal whose instinctive response to any surprise is to run away. Consequently, the Frenchtown Star admonished, tie your horses when you leave them on the street. The gentlest horse in existence may get scared at something. The pages of the old newspapers are peppered with accounts of horses fleeing from things as big as a freight train or as little as a scrap of paper. I don't know where the cavalry got its war horses, but they weren't from Frenchtown. So there's all these stories about runaway horses. And then there was a little editorial note that, the editors, they have to write things to fill up the paper, and sometimes when you read back on them, we have the benefit of hindsight to see how foolish they were. One thing I learned in my studies, if anyone's acquainted with Frenchtown, there's a park. The main park in town is called Borough Park. Well, from reading the 1940s Delaware News on microfilm, I learned that park was acquired in 1945, and there was a vote by readers of the paper, and it was official, and they voted to name the park Frenchtown War Memorial Park. It was 1945, and in my whole life, I've never heard it called that. Just Borough Park. So, an editorial writer in the Delaware News wrote that this is a fine thing. A park is a great memorial for this terrible war, and much better than a statue like we did for World War I. So, a park is better than a statue, but as a memorial, it was a big zero. Anyway, so anyway, another editorial guest that didn't turn out so well. In 1888, the Frenchtown Star wrote, after all these runaways they've been writing about for decades, and would write about for decades more, it says, when in the course of time, the Star predicted in 1888, electricity or something of that sort shall supersede horses altogether as a motive power for drawing loads on the highways, damage to life and property will be of rare occurrence, and runaways will be a thing of the past. Not exactly. First, there would be an overlap of a couple of decades as automobiles provide a fresh source of terror for horses. Then decades of automotive carnage on our county and state highways would make runaways seem like jolly fun. So, now, the first automobile came to Frenchtown on July 2nd, 1900. And here's the editor, William Sipes, in the Frenchtown Star. He wrote, here's the entire report. The first automobile was here on Monday and was quite a curiosity. That's it. How could editor William Sipes know that this curiosity would kill Frenchtown's horse and harness businesses, its railroad, its big stores, and several residents, while giving rise to many new businesses? So, and now we come to, I learned a new word, which it's not worth knowing because I can't pronounce it. A 5-year period, like 10 years is a decade. Very handy to say, but there's only one term for a 5-year period, and it is quinquennium. Unsayable, but I wish it were sayable, because there was a very critical 5-year period in Frenchtown history, and in 1900, I'm talking 1900 to 1905, in 1900, there was no city water, no hydrants, no tap water. There was no electricity. There was no telephone, and nobody owned a car. Okay? By 1905, we had our first car owner. We had a water system with several hydrants and a reservoir and tap water when you hooked into it. We had telephone service, and we had electricity. It must have made their heads spin to have all that happen in a 5-year period. And to extend it to a 10-year period, we also had movies and radio. So it was big doings. So that's the yeah. I can't say it. Okay, now there's an interesting guy named Kenneth Hahn, H-A-N-N, and when he was a kid, he rescued a drowning boy. Okay, now I'll read you about that. Let's see, when was this? It was 1929. Alex Palaznik, a 10-year-old from Baptistown, decided to improve upon his lunch break from Frenchtown's school by swimming across the river in June of 1929. But about halfway across, his strength failed him. Kenneth Hahn, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ray Hahn, heard his cries and jumped in to help him. After a hard swim, Hahn finally reached Palaznik and brought him safely to shore, the Hunterdon Independent reported. Kenneth was about 18 at the time. Now here's an odd tidbit. 3 years earlier, when Hahn was about 15, he had gone swimming with his friend Walter Chubby Diltz, and they had accidentally splashed their clothing. When they got dressed and went into town, their friends asked about their wet clothes. They made up a story on the spot in which Chubby fell out of a boat and Ken jumped in and saved him. The tale spread through town. And then here the Independent wrote, even some of the out-of-town papers bit on the story and published accounts of the heroic action, wrote the Independent. But it was, it wasn't really a thing. But then, interestingly enough, maybe that gave Ken the idea to actually do a real rescue 3 years later. I don't know. But we haven't heard the last of Ken. He grew up and he became a mailman. Okay? And there was a dog. Okay, let's see. Okay. He was involved with a dog, okay? Although dogs and letter carriers are natural enemies, In the 1940s, mailmen found they had a friend in Inky. She was a fair-sized, mostly black dog who came to Frenchtown with Raymond and Loretta Sipe when they took over the National Hotel in 1941. In her native Easton, Inky had liked to accompany postmen on their routes, and she resumed this practice here. In 45, she chose a favorite, Kenneth Hahn. After 5 years of companionship, Hahn said, "She is intelligent and knows the route as well as I do." He felt lonely on days when she didn't show up. Now here's the interesting part. Half a block from the Sipes Hotel, the National, lived Reva and Raymond Inky Fargo. Fargo was a World War I veteran whose nickname, Inky, came from an old Army song he liked to sing. His musical Inky Dinky Parlez-Vous may have summoned the dog. But for whatever reason, around 1947, Inky the dog decided to move in with Inky the man. The Sipes respected her wishes. So, it can't be a coincidence that Inky the dog wanted to live with Inky the man. There had to be some kind of thing. So, there you go.
It's interesting that these would be in the newspapers too.
Yeah.
Story like that.
This is my kind of newspaper. You know, my favorite story of the Democrat was a story about a woman driving through Califon when a squirrel fell out of a tree into her sunroof. So, anyway, now there was a period of time in the 50s and 60s when kids were drag racing, mostly on Route 29. It's a nice straight shot down along the river. But I read about an accident where two boys drove a car into the Delaware River from the Pennsylvania side, okay? And I didn't think it really had a place in my book. But then 4 days after I read that story, I was at the National Hotel waiting to meet people. I was going to take them on one of my tours of Frenchtown. And there was an old guy, that's somebody even older than me. There was an old guy sitting on the porch. I said, "Oh, are you here for the tour?" And he said, "No, I used to live here, and I'm just sort of back visiting. I'm staying in the hotel." And we started chatting, and before long, he's telling me about driving a car into the river. And I said, "I just read about that 4 days ago." And he said, "Yeah, I lived in Frenchtown on Kingwood Avenue, and my friend Richard Besh had a car, and he was going to take me to the roller rink, but he had to do something first. We drove over to Pennsylvania, and he met up with this other guy, and we raced on Muellerstown Road, and we went right into the river. We won the race, but we went into the river." And he's telling me the story. He says, he does it like this. He says, "We went right into the river. Blah, blah, blah." He said they escaped out the driver's side door. They kind of scraped up a little bit, and they swam to safety. This was April. It was cold water, and kind of a wonder they survived. And so I went. So now that I knew, and I said, "Oh, the newspapers. I just read about that. The newspaper didn't say it was a drag race." And he said, "Oh, there was a witness, but we denied it." So my book gets to set the record straight, but just the chances of just that connection to see him. Now I tried to crowdsource some things that I just don't know and like to know. And very often when you try to get rational discourse out of, or information out of Facebook, it's kind of like, well, when I went to the planetarium with my daughter's first grade class, they were first graders, okay? So the guy at the planetarium is explaining the stars and the moon and the heavens and all this, and he says, "Are there any questions?" And the little girl raises her hand, and he says, "Yes," and she says, "My name is Ashley." And that's what you get on Facebook a lot. So, but the one time I struck gold was when, in Frenchtown lore, I had heard of the cigarette train wreck, okay? And I didn't know when it was. I didn't know really what it entailed. So I Facebooked it. Anybody know when the cigarette train wreck was? And it was a pinata of stuff. And so it's probably the most colorful thing ever happened in Frenchtown. And I don't get to talk about it on my tours because we don't go there. And so I'll tell you about the cigarette train wreck here. Okay. It happened on September 21st, 1969. A broken axle. Now, there used to be a railroad ran along the river, past Frenchtown, past Milford, between Trenton and Phillipsburg. Okay. A broken axle sent 13 freight cars off the rails into Sylvester Compton's cornfield, just south of the Milford paper mill. Several of them were boxcars filled with cigarettes, and at least one of them had broken open like a piñata, spilling thousands of cartons of cigarettes out among the tall corn. The cleanup involved cranes mounted on rail cars, which helped replace hundreds of feet of damaged track and lifted boxcars and tankers back onto the rails. In some cases, new sets of wheels had to be welded on. The sparks from that operation set a wooden boxcar floor on fire, and that cigarette-filled car was rolled down to the porcelain field in Frenchtown near 12th Street, where Frenchtown firefighters could extinguish the flames. To give them access, railroad workers pulled out the cargo and spread it on the ground. My folks always called it the day Frenchtown took up smoking, recalled Chris Hargrave. The news reported, from Saturday night through Tuesday, persons were taking away armfuls and carloads of cigarettes, with railroad salvage crewmen helping them. Richard Aller remembered, the railroad people were giving them away because they said they were contaminated from the smoke, were going to be destroyed. Daniel Brown, 12, rode his bike to the scene. Quote, there was a lot of people there, probably between 40 and 50. There were thousands of cartons of cigarettes all thrown on the ground. A crowd of people were filling up their cars and pockets with cigarettes, he said. I filled up 2 of my cloth sacks I used for delivering newspapers with cartons and rode them back to the house for my parents. He made 2 trips. My father took the Salem cigarettes as they were his brand, and my mother took the other cartons and sold them in the vending machine she had in her restaurant, Vi Brown's Little White House restaurant. Bill Sheets said our next door neighbor had 20 peach baskets full of cigarettes in his basement. I was up there at the wreck, said Jill Thatcher Haver. I ran home and I told my parents, and we loaded up the station wagon with tons of cigarettes. Kevin Stone was 12. He came uptown with his friends Russell Pinkerton, Eddie Frank, Bobby Fisher, and a boy named George, whose nickname was Froggy. Stone said the railroad workers offloading the boxes were jolly, and one of them handed us a box and told us to take it to her parents. Instead, the boys took the box to Russell's garage to go through it. They found Camel and Lucky Strike cigarettes, cigars, pipe tobacco, and chewing tobacco, which Kevin sampled. It made me sick as hell, he said. The cigarettes and cigars weren't much better, but the boys took their loot up into their tree fort on the hill behind the roller rink. Stone recalled that despite the foul taste, and with so much adult contraband in hand, we were kings. They never told their parents about the box. The cornfield site of the derailment was secured, but Compton's 17-year-old son Lou had access. I got a bushel basket and gathered up some cigarettes and stashed them in the barn, he said. They might have been Winston's, but whatever the brand, it was the start of a 50-year habit. Apart from a truckload of menthol cigarettes claimed by his aunt, the rest of the goods spilled at the site were buried by a bulldozer, he recalled. Now, I hate to be competitive with Milford, which I always like to be. The Milford train wreck of 1877 killed 6 people. How many people did the Frenchtown train wreck actually kill?
A long time later.
Never know. Never know.
What year was that?
That was 68. 68. Okay. Now, I got two more things to tell you about. One is a person, not a thing. Cropping up in the news at all times is Eldon Cooley. And I never met him. He lived till 1980. But he was always in trouble for one thing and another. And I don't think it bothered him. So I'll tell you about some of his trouble. Eldon Cooley, born 1889, died 1980, had enough entrepreneurial zip to propel 3 or 4 good-sized go-getters. He owned the third largest chicken hatchery in town. He had a Ford dealership in Lambertville, 1920 to 24, and in the 40s he established gas stations in Lambertville, Phillipsburg, Trenton, Frenchtown, and Milford. The Frenchtown station was on Race Street, on the now empty site where pollution remediation goes on and on. A busy bee by any standard, Cooley had more on his mind than chickens and gasoline. His first marriage was to Frances Fanny Lance in 1907, but just over a year later she went home to her parents, alleging cruel and unjust treatment. Cooley charged her with desertion, and she divorced him in 1912. In 1913, the Star reported that Cooley, who was on a trip out of state, was wanted by Kingwood authorities, quote, on a serious charge of a young woman who was formerly employed by him at his chick hatchery. By 1915, he had married Elizabeth Upton. Although their union lasted until death parted them, it had one highly public intermission. Here's all capital headline. Married man and girl found in Ohio was the headline in the Star on August 6, 1919. A young Frenchtown woman and Cooley had run off together. They were traced to Plymouth, Ohio, where Cooley was made a prisoner. The Star predicted inaccurately this, his latest escapade, may land him in prison for a long term. In its report on Cooley's hanky-panky, the Star has him charged with eloping with a 18-year-old telephone girl from this borough. That particular crime might not be illegal anymore, but it remains inadvisable. He was extradited and fetched back to Hunter County, where he was fined $2,000 and costs, and put on probation for 3 years. I don't know what he was charged with, but $2,000 in 1919 was a lot of money. In 1926, Cooley received bad news from another judge. He ruled that Cooley had infringed on a patent. Cooley had used one of Buckeye Incubator Company's small incubators as a model for building his own large incubators. Cooley was ordered to share his profits with Buckeye. During Prohibition, Cooley had a son running liquor into Atlantic City, according to a descendant, who I will not name. The car was equipped with secret compartments and extra stiff leaf springs so they wouldn't sag when the car was heavily loaded. Cooley was never caught at that, but during World War II, he was punished for selling black market gasoline and tires, which were rationed and you just can't sell them to anybody you want to. On August 20, 1955, the day after the valley's biggest flood crested, authorities were trying to screen out sightseers who might impede emergency efforts, but Cooley wasn't having it. Trooper Herbert Diner testified that when Cooley's car turned from Kingwood Avenue onto Race Street, he stepped forward and motioned for Cooley to stop. Cooley just shouted, "Get the hell out of my way," and slowly proceeded, his car brushing the trooper's boot and bumping the barricade. They went to court. The prosecutor called Cooley a smart aleck, but he got off with a $75 fine. Later, it's not in the book, but later Cooley would, I think it was in the 60s, there was a plane crash near the Newark airport, and Cooley came up with the idea that they should not have an airport in highly populated Newark. They should have it in Hunter County. And he recommended the flat area between Flemington and Pittstown and some senator. He had the ear of some senators, and it made a bunch of headlines in the Del Valle News, and eventually nothing came of it. Would have been a real life changer for some of us. And he said a 6-7 mile runway would be no problem because hardly anyone lives in that part of the county.
Our runway was on the top there in Lockdown.
Any jets come there?
No jets, no.
Okay, now one final thing that I want to share is since you know I'm known to some people as being interested in history, a woman gave me this object, and what this is, and she gave it to me right during the summer of lockdown. Okay, when people were learning Italian and making sourdough bread and all that. My version of that was to examine this artifact that she gave me, and it says Ration Book 2. This originally contained stamps during World War II. You had certain coupons to get gasoline and sugar and things like that. But it's just a container for all these file cards. And these file cards, which are brown with age, I examined them at great length. The handwriting is really hard to read, but if you figure that letter looks like that by this person, if you really have too much time on your hands, you can figure it out. So what this is I don't know if they had them when you were in high school. We called them a slam book. I think in Mean Girls they call them a burn book. It's like these 3 old ladies sat around and made a card for everybody they remembered that they had something catty to say about them. Okay, so it's like and there's all kinds of clues here. I think it was done in the 1950s, when these ladies were in their 60s. Okay, and the woman who gave me this was a descendant of the Apker, one of the Apker sisters. And Daisy Apker was the only one of them that got married. If you're acquainted with Frenchtown, the Apkers used to, all the sisters were born in the National Hotel when their father owned it in the 1890s. And then in 1910, they bought a house on Bridge Street, and it's sort of a mansion. It's got a tower, and it's very elegant. Anyway, so the one sister married, and the 3 other sisters lived out their lives there. The last one dying in 1984. Okay, and the woman who gave me this, she was the granddaughter of Daisy Apker, the one who moved away. But Daisy, her descendants had inherited everything from the Apker house. So almost certainly, there's 3 different kinds of handwriting here. My wife assures me that they are all women. and so it's almost certainly the work of the 3 Apker sisters sitting around, killing time, amusing themselves, remembering people. And some of the stuff is very scandalous, some of it is just sort of funny, and some of it is just sort of interesting. Like Jacob Buck, he's identified, all they had to say about him was the only Catholic in town. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I never thought about how many Catholics there might have been in town, but I guess not many. So anyway, here's a few of the best ones. Tom LaRue, and it's like last name first, hyphen, it's like they're gonna file it somewhere. And it says, long whiskers, slowest paper hanger in Hunterdon County. Okay? Here's the one about Johnson Warford, although they call him Johns. His brother owned what became the Frenchtown Inn. It was the Warford House. Anyway, what they had to say about him was, didn't believe in taking clothes off at night and dressing up again in something different the next morning. That was kind of interesting. Okay, now there is a senator, William Martin, and I knew that he had pet alligators, okay, around 1900. So they say, Willie Martin, state senator, racetrack vote equals a house with all the trimmings. In other words, they're implying that he sold his vote on the racetrack. And then it says 2 alligators, 2 ponies, and a cart. And one of the sisters wrote, sat in corner of yard and fanned all summer. And then the other sister wrote, took bribes all winter in Senate. I have no idea whether that's true or not. It just might be gratuitous defaming of him. I don't know. Then there's a guy named Tom Palmer, and he was a butcher. He was the 7th mayor of Frenchtown, and he was the postmaster for a while. And the interesting thing they have to say about him is Emily Updike said Martin's alligators had mouths, just like Tom Palmer. Now, there's a woman named Sally Walbert, okay? And what they say about her is, worked Blanche Schaffner to death, then left all her money to Christian Science Monitor. So, I through this website called FamilySearch.org, you can access people on the census forms. So I looked up Sally Walbert, and there was a Sarah Walbert, and she did have a live-in servant named Blanche, who was, in 1910, Blanche was 20 years old. So it sort of verifies a little bit of it. I have no idea what to make of it. Then there's Stacy Neese. It says, milkman with a terrific rear end. The rear end is in quotes. And so, okay. There's another reference to Stacy Neese. Okay, now here's the last one I'm going to read, and it's the most scandalous. Myers, Maud, in other words, Maud Myers, it says, stood naked in front of window, knocked on window, and whistled. Stacy Neese looked up at her. She looked up. She said, rubber, which was short for rubbernecking, like looking around. Okay. She said, rubber, you old son of a bitch. And then it says, charged 10 cents for a look at her in tub. Now, being a hard worker here, I found a conversion chart. So 10 cents in, I'm guessing 1910, that would be $3.20 in today's money. So a look at Maud would be affordable to almost anyone. So there you go. So those are my big discoveries, and had a lot of fun with it. So there you go. The end. Yeah, thanks for